Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Revolution Recap. The Revs had a total meltdown this week in scenic Chester, Pennsylvania, as the Union scored 5 times in the second half, earning a 6-1 victory over the Revs. The Revs remain at the bottom of the table with 8 points in 11 games, and now have the worst goal differential in MLS after conceding 10 times in the last 2 games and 13 times in the last 3. I'm Greg Johnstone. Joining me, as always, is Sean Donahue. Sean, how's it going?
I'm probably doing better than you after you ran 10 miles this morning, so you feeling it?
Yes, I'm very much feeling it. I ran the Broad Street 10-mile race today, and I've not run that distance in years. So I am more or less getting up from a nap about 20 minutes ago, but I'm still feeling it. So if I seem a little low energy today, a little jeb, that's the reason why. So, but overall, I'm awake, I'm alive, my legs are still attached to me. So overall, that's a pretty big positive.
You need a little work on the fitness to fit into the high press?
I don't think I'm there quite just yet, but I was pretty consistent the entire way through. I was still, at the same pace about mile 9 as I was mile 2. So unlike the Revolution, I put on a consistent performance this week in Philadelphia. So I think I have that going for me. So, but Sean, let's get to complaining about the Revolution, kind of our new pastime with this podcast. What was your main takeaway from this complete mess of a soccer game?
Yeah, I was ready to talk about how the first half of this game was, arguably the best half of soccer the Revolution have played all season. And there's been a lot of complaints all season long about how poorly the Revs have started a game, and they finally, they gave up a really sloppy goal, but otherwise they had a good first half. They were all over the Union for much of that first half. And then the second half was the worst half of soccer we've seen them play all season, which is saying a lot because they've played a lot of terrible halves of soccer this season. It's my takeaway jumped from one thing to the next with that second half of soccer. But I think my final takeaway from this one is that, every time the Revolution take one step forward, they take another step backwards. So they fixed their first half of soccer play. The past 2 weeks, they had solid first halves, only to collapse in the second half. So early on in the season, we were hearing Friedel talk about how they would have good second halves and do horrible in the first half. Now it's the opposite. And now that we're a season and a third in to Brad Friedel's tenure, it's a little bit too late for the Revolution to still be trying to figure out how to play a full 90 minutes of soccer. If Brad Friedel hasn't figured out how to get the team to do that now, it's probably time to move on. And a loss like this is a loss that can get a coach fired. I'm not sure that's what's going to happen after this game. I'm sure he'll probably get more time, especially if that DP is actually coming. But it's just there's no fixing this team, I think, is my takeaway from this game. Not with the current coaching staff.
And we have some questions too about Brad Friedel's coaching status, and we get those questions seemingly after every loss. But there are losses that you can kind of feel it. It's either embarrassing or a collapse, or just there are some losses that are worse than others, and this certainly feels like one of them. The terrible thing too is that the Revolution were the better team in the first half of the game. Like you said, they went into a road game. They played very, very well.
They had really 4 big chances in the first half to compare to 0 for Philadelphia. So it was 1-1, but the Revolution had 4 big chances. They don't usually get 4 big chances in a game. I don't know if they have all season. And
then they had 0 in the second half too. It really felt like Philadelphia was lucky to be tied 1-1 going into halftime. And then the second half starts to concede early, but the Revolution seemed to be still fighting along. And then after that third goal in the 69th minute, you could just see them kind of just lose all effort whatsoever. It seemed like they were just trying to get out of there as soon as possible. They really weren't putting any energy at all. And, I think compared to this and the Montreal game that we had last week, that's 2 of the last 3 games where, the team just kind of quits. And when teams are quitting early and checking out, that really doesn't speak well on the coach. So, I think I always had the opinion that Brad Friedel was getting a full solid 2 seasons, but I don't know how many more losses you can have where players are just flat out not playing anymore. Until you realize that this is a locker room that needs a lot of changes, and it all starts with the coach. So, I agree with that kind of assessment. It's a bit rough, but that second half was probably one of the worst halves of the year, if not the worst. And it followed up a really, really solid 45 minutes for the Revolution, and it's it is a shame, but that kind of just speaks to the way their season is going. And we're only in May. I mean, we are 2 months into the season. There's a lot of soccer still to be played. And yeah, we'll get a little bit more into it later, but it's amazing that we're already at this point. That just kind of shows you how sideways this season has gone. My key takeaway is probably the one positive that I think I can take away from this match. I'm going to be a little glass half full, and it's going to be kind of compounding on my key takeaway last week, which is that I think Caicedo too, Juan Fernando Caicedo, I think he's a pretty good player. I think they have a really, really nice striker in Juan Fernando Caicedo. He scored again yesterday. He's seemingly going to go right over that over under 5 threshold that I had set for him. But a really nice touch for a goal yesterday. He had a couple of other nice passes to set up some plays. I know Tayon Buchanan, he had a left-footed shot on goal. It wasn't the best shot, but Caicedo had a really nice backheel pass to set him up. He is not someone that is going to turn an entire game around, but for the Revolution, who have had a difficulty finding the goal, finding shots on target, finding some accurate finishes, I think Juan Fernando Caicedo is kind of fitting the bill, and I think they've found their striker going forward.
No, that's the one positive I think you can take from this game is Juan Fernando Caicedo followed up a 2-goal effort with a goal in this one. That was a real striker's finish. Wasn't the easiest chance, a one-timer, and that's the type of thing that you want to see from Juan Fernando Caicedo. He also was good in possession. He had 86% passing accuracy. He had 3 chances created, 3 key passes in this one, which has got to be the record for him so far this season. And took 3 shots overall, 2 on target. That's what you want to see out of Juan Fernando Caicedo. And we were down on him early on. Last week we saw him get some confidence building goals, and this week we saw him get another goal and really play a good game overall. I don't think there's many players that can come out of this game with their heads held high or that you can give a lot of credit to, but Juan Caicedo might be the only one, maybe Carles Gil as well. But that is absolutely the one positive you can take from this is the Revolution do have one striker on the roster who can finish. On the flip side, to go negative, Juan Agudelo had 5 shots, none on target, including a couple of sitters that a striker of what should be his caliber should put away 9 times or 10 times out of 10. So if there was any hope that kind of the easy finish that he had last week would get him on track, it certainly didn't in this game. So for Juan Caicedo, plenty to be positive about. For Juan Agudelo, back pretty down on him after this game, I would say.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up Juan Agudelo. Obviously, you said 0 for 5 on shots on target. As a whole, the team struggled. 4 shots on target for the Revolution, 16 shots, so about 25% shot accuracy yesterday. Juan Agudelo does a lot of good things. He does hold the ball well. He has some good ball skills, but yeah, he doesn't seem to be doesn't seem to have that striker's touch. Is not really getting shots on target very much. I know he had a 1 last week. He did score last week. He did have another chance that missed last week, and then it wasn't really a cross, but there was that ground ball, I'll say, that was rolling across the face of goal that Agudelo was right there for. Seemingly skied the ball over the net. I guess just couldn't get a handle on it. That really could have changed the entire perception of the game, because then the Revolution probably go into halftime with a lead. So, not exactly a stellar outing from Agudelo. I do think we'll see him more. He had 80% pass accuracy. As I say, he did a lot of little things right, but for some reason he is just not there, not scoring goals, not getting shots on target, and it's quite frustrating to see, because, if there was someone, in a 2-striker system, it'd be nice to have more than 1 striker finding shots on target.
Yeah, and I mentioned the Revolution were credited with 4 big chances in the first half. 2 of those big chances fell to Juan Agudelo, and neither of those ended up on frame. One of those was, just a couple yards out from goal that he sent wide, and then I think the other was a header that he sent wide. So really a disappointing effort from Juan Agudelo, who, like I said, you'd hoped had gotten some confidence from the previous game when he finally found the back of the net. I agree with you. He's probably going to see more minutes. He did some, he's done some other good things the past 2 games, but you need your striker to be putting away chances like that, especially, the Revolution, their margin for error is not very high this season with how many goals they've been leaking. You knew the Revolution weren't going to get a shutout in this game, and you certainly knew they probably weren't going to hold on to, even just 1 goal that they'd given up given the injuries they had. So that, that's really disappointing from Juan Agudelo, who, I think last year he finished with 3 goals. This year he's got 1. For a guy that had such high hopes and potential, and we've hit a home run on this one a lot, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on it. It was just another disappointing effort where someone that should be the caliber that you'd think he would be would put those chances away. And it's really coming to hurt the Revolution in a game like this one, where they could have been up 2 or 3 goals at halftime, perhaps, if they had really put away their chances the way they should have. 4 big chances and 1 goal out of them is not a good conversion rate by anyone's standards.
Yeah, and it's something that I think we're getting accustomed to more and more after every game. But Sean, let's stop complaining about the offense, because that's not really what we're here to do today. Let's go straight to that back line, because we have a lot of criticisms of the defense today. And let's start with the captain, Michael Mancienne. A bit of an interesting comment after the game by Brad Friedel. Brad Friedel kind of implying that Mancienne was still hurt. He was still playing. He was on painkillers, according to Brad Friedel. Mancienne, too, had an okay game, 5 clearances, 1 block, 1 interception. Usually we expect some better numbers from him, but it kind of makes sense that he was hurt. He did not seem to be 100%. Sean, what did you think of his performance?
Yeah, I mean, I thought he was really bad in the second half when apparently he was in more pain and struggling. I think he said that he was struggling in the second half. For his own quote was, in the first half I was all right, second half I started to feel it. It's not an excuse. I need to get on with it, end quote. And it did show in the second half. I think in some of those late goals especially, he was completely flat-footed and didn't really look like he could sprint, which is not ideal. So yes, some of that falls on Mancienne for not being able to play through the pain better, I guess. I didn't think it was a particularly good game from overall, even with the first half. But more of that falls on Mike Burns for leaving the Revolution roster in such a terrible shape, where a couple of injuries to the defense and they're absolutely decimated and can't find a player to step in. And a third of the way through the season, they're already having to force a guy to play on painkillers just to have enough bodies to play defense. That's just absolutely terrible. Anyone that's followed this team knows their defensive depth has been poor. I don't know why they didn't go out there and sign some help in the preseason. That was certainly obvious. It's certainly been obvious the past few weeks that they really need defensive depth. So that 100% falls on Mike Burns for a complete failure to go out there and get somebody to help this defense. And again, it's been like that way for several years. It's been really thin on defense, and they haven't done anything to fix it. It's kind of embarrassing at this point that they get to a third of the way through the season and they're forcing their captain in his 30s to play on painkillers. But I don't know what you can do. The Revolution in past years have brought in guys that maybe haven't been the highest caliber, a guy like an Otto Lowy I'm thinking of, a guy like a London Woodbury. Why can't you go out there and get a guy like that right now to step in? Because what's going on there right now with forcing veterans to play when they're injured, forcing veterans to play out of position. You can't do much worse than that if you were to go out there and sign maybe a college player that was on the fringes or some guy out of the USL. I don't get what they're waiting for. They have an open roster spot. They have 2 open roster spots. One of them's an international. I'm sure they're saving that for the DP. But one of those, can't be an international. So why aren't you going out there and signing somebody? And, if down the road you need to open up more roster spots, you buy out Gabriel Somi, which you should have done in the preseason. That's, another point to hit home on here now. Is how bad does it look that they didn't buy out Gabriel Somi in preseason, where they could have saved his salary cap space. They could have, freed up the international spot. They didn't do that. They can still buy him out now, but they're not saving the cap space. But if that guy can't make the 18 in games like this, we've, talked about this ad nauseum at this point. How bad does that look in the Revolution organization that they didn't just go out and buy him out before the season? It's kind of pathetic.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we've complained about Somi a million times before. And, we weren't huge fans of him, but I believe this is 2 straight games where there's no defenders on the bench, or no natural defenders. I guess Wilfred Zahibo is technically a center back or can play a center back or whatever. But it is a little unfortunate. Edgar Castillo is really the only defender that kind of has that position locked down at left back, and that's the position that Gabriel Somi plays. But even still, you got to think that in the event that Castillo is hurt, or if you need someone to play right back, I can't imagine why Gabriel Somi can't play there. So yeah, it seems to be very confusing to why they didn't buy him out. He was in the 18 once this season, and they didn't play him, and they're not going to play him at all this season. It's pretty apparent that he's not going to be a part of this team, even when there are no defenders available on the bench. They'd rather roll with that than putting Somi in the 18. So yeah, very, very confusing to why he's still in the team and why he wasn't bought out in the first place. And you can go let him sign back in Europe, and everyone can move on. Instead, they're kind of holding him hostage for the time being. But moving back on to Michael Mancienne, there were those comments about him kind of falling apart in the second half. I think it was actually pretty obvious early in the first half. that he had a couple of plays where he seemed to be lagging a little bit behind. The 7th minute, Alejandro Bedoya got in behind the back line. Behind Michael Mancienne. And then a couple minutes later, there was a long ball where Andrew Farrell was able to recover kind of a streaking player, and Caldwell was the second guy back. And it looked like Caldwell was kind of turned around and looked around, and he seemed to be looking for Michael Mancienne, who was a little bit far up the field. So knowing now what we know, I think Michael Mancienne was in pain and probably wasn't 100% to get back on those plays. But you can kind of tell early that the Union were trying to exploit that backline pairing of Farrell and Mancienne. And I don't know if they knew that Mancienne was hurt early as well. But, I mean, if you look at the 11th minute goal, they go right down the center of the field. Jack Elliott kind of squeezes behind. It looks like Scott Caldwell probably should have tracked him a little bit better and stopped that ball from getting through. But I mean, he is perfectly right between Andrew Farrell and Michael Mancienne, and it seems to be that's where the Union felt the weak spot of the game was, and it certainly worked out for them very well.
Yeah, that first goal I think falls on Caldwell more than anyway. That was pretty poor on his part to not track his man, and then he kind of seemed like he was in a position where he could have perhaps blocked the pass, but it was a bit too slow to react to that as well. But yeah, we've seen all season where defenders have been split, and there's been a guy right between them, and neither of the defenders have necessarily been covering anybody, and nobody's gone to mark him, and that was another case of that. But I think that one, if I were to place more blame on that one, it would go on Caldwell. But no, I agree that Mancienne throughout the match didn't look 100%, and especially in the second half, he looked worn down. But just on that note, I think it is worthwhile pointing out that Philadelphia played a midweek game. Philadelphia was down to their third string goalkeeper. Philadelphia's starting striker is having visa issues and might not be able to play for them for 3 months, so he wasn't there for this game. This wasn't a Philadelphia team that was 100% strength. They had an injury in the 36th minute as well. So the Revolution have their excuses with injuries. Philadelphia have their excuses with injuries, and they were on short rest. So I think that's worthwhile and important to point out because, often you hear excuses made for the Revolution and all the injuries they've had. In the last few games, the Revolution have had a lot of advantages. Kansas City was an extremely depleted lineup. Kansas City was so depleted that they had to cancel practice this week because they only had 6 healthy field players at one point. So that gives you an idea of how depleted they were when they faced the Revolution last weekend. And then Philadelphia, like I said, down to their third string goalkeeper, missing their starting striker. These are games where the Revolution should be able to take advantage and get something out of them. And for the first half, it looked like the Revolution were taking advantage of Kansas City, having less rest. But Philadelphia having less rest than they did. And then in the second half, the Revolution looked like the dead team, despite the fact that it was Philadelphia that had played on Wednesday.
Yep. No, absolutely. And one more point too to make about the lack of depth along the offensive line. And I just want to touch back on another point about this is a real failure of the front office to build that depth. But you'll remember too, going back to the Super Draft, they drafted Tayon Buchanan and DeJuan Jones in the first round. Both picks that we liked. Both seem to be working out very well for the slots that the Revolution drafted in. But you'll remember, too, that they passed on drafting in the second, third, and fourth round. They sent all of their picks to D.C. United. I mean, they could have used one of those picks for a young center back. You can keep him for a year just as depth until you find another player the next year. 2 years ago, they drafted Josh Smith. Last year, there was Samoya. This year, they have absolutely no fourth center back.
Samoya just scored a goal, by the way. Shout out to him.
But
wherever he's playing now.
Again? Where is he?
Wherever he's playing right now. I retweeted it. He got a nice little goal this weekend.
He's playing in like the Nicaraguan Premier League. I mean, it's really not anything. But you understand the point where, you could have had a guy making a minimum salary on the supplemental roster who, in the event of an emergency, he could step in and play. And we did see Josh Smith play that game in Seattle where he was needed to come in 1 week after, I don't remember the exact scenario, but it was either a red card or injury. And Josh Smith did very, very well. And I think that something like that would be better than, throwing Michael Mancienne out there on painkillers and risk him aggravating an injury further. That would be So anyway, that's just a bit of a rant I have. There were ways they could have built depth and not necessarily going out to a South American club or a European club and finding a high-priced acquisition. There are ways you could have cheaply built depth from within, and the Revolution chose not to do it. They chose to play 3 center backs, and this year it's really hurting them.
And just to clarify, Samoya is playing in Guatemala and his goal was actually like a nice volley into the upper corner. So if you haven't seen it, it's a good one. But yeah, I don't think he's the answer to helping the Revs out. But it's just mentioning him as a one of those guys you could have drafted, like they did last year, drafting a guy like that, is probably a better bet than playing a guy in painkillers, or if they had been forced to play Zahibo back there, I think it's probably a better bet than that too. It's not that hard to go out there and get a serviceable center back to be your fourth string guy on the roster, and they just haven't done it, which is shocking at this point.
Yep. So yeah, go to Sean's Twitter feed to check out that goal. Congrats on Nicolas Samoya on scoring his first professional goal before Hauche. So, Sean, let's kind of move on. We just touched on Scott Caldwell. We'll get to the rest of the back line in a second, but I think there are a couple of goals that you could kind of blame on him. He seemed to be lagging a little bit behind. It wasn't really a great performance from Caldwell at all. He did have 88% pass accuracy, 3 interceptions. He was over 3 on tackles, no blocks, 1 clearance. He seemed to put in an okay shift on paper, but there were a number of plays he seemed to be dragging a little bit behind. It was very un-Scott Caldwell-like. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. That first one, I think he knew it was his fault. You could see how he reacted on that play. Disappointment from him. He's usually a very consistent and solid player, but I think we saw, last year under Friedel, he made a bit more mistakes than are usually of him characteristically. So this was disappointing to see out of Scott Caldwell. We usually expect better from him. He didn't have too many turnovers in this one, so good for him in that, and a lot of other players did, but not one of his best outings for sure.
And let's wrap up on the back line. Let's lump them all together. Edgar Castillo, Luis Caicedo, Andrew Farrell. I don't know if anyone had a really good game. I thought Andrew Farrell played okay. He had a couple of moments where he kind of cleared off a little bit of danger. I think he made up for Mancien not being 100% a little bit. He seemed to cover for Mancien on some plays. But, Sean, give your assessment of those other 3 defenders overall.
Yeah, so I want to focus on Castillo for a minute because I thought Castillo had a terrible game. I thought the Philadelphia Union targeted him. Aronson had good runs at him, and then when Ilacinho came on, he was absolutely destroying Castillo. Castillo had a fantastic assist on Caicedo's goal, so credit to him on that through ball. And I think Castillo is more of a attacking left back than he is a defensive left back. And we've seen some good presence from him on the attack, but throughout the season we've seen him struggle a bit defensively. And this game was one where it was really highlighted. It seemed like Philadelphia knew he could be a defensive weakness, and they targeted him. And I got to admit, from watching him over the years, I thought he was a better defensive player than we've seen so far with him with the Revolution. It's worth pointing out that when he was in Colorado played a lot of 5-man backlines where he was playing more as a wing back, so his defensive duties were more limited. But I expected him to be a better defender for the Revolution than he has been, and this game really highlighted that his defensive liabilities. He got beat one-on-one a lot in this game. That was big disappointment, really hurt the Revolution. We talked about Mancien. I thought Farrell had an okay game. There was at least one goal that he got beat on that I thought he should have done better on. It's very difficult for a defender like Farrell to have to keep switching back and forth from right back to center back as he has been, again, due to the Revolution's terrible depth. And, covering for Luis Caicedo playing right back isn't the easiest thing either, because Caicedo is, not a great right back. We've talked about that before. On that note, I don't think Caicedo was particularly at fault for any of the goals. I don't think he was the Revs' biggest liability, even playing out of position. But I also don't think he did too much to help. And he finished with just 50% passing, but defensively, he wasn't a huge liability. I think Philadelphia attacked Castillo more than they attacked Caicedo, which is saying something. But none of those defenders can leave this game thinking they did a good job.
Yeah, no, I agree with kind of everything you said there. I think they are using Luis Caicedo at right back because they don't really want him playing central midfield in a 4-4-2. I assume he would replace Scott Caldwell in that lineup because you have to have Carlos Gil somewhere in there. So Luis Caicedo is kind of unfortunately being wasted in some respects with this formation. But him at right back, I'm not really sure about. I'm not feeling very strongly about. We have seen him. Was it the Montreal game where he was pushing up, he pushed up field and that right flank was exploited? I'm not so sure. It didn't seem like the worst performance from him overall, but the more I see at Luis Caicedo at right back, the less I like. So I'm curious to see if Scott Caldwell survives the lineup next week, or if we see Luis Caicedo move back to the center, because in theory we have Ibaba and De La Maya back, even if Michael Mancienne is not 100%. I wouldn't be shocked to see Andrew Phil move back to right back, and Luis Caicedo would be free to return to the central midfield where I think he plays best. But who knows? We'll see.
Well, you know what's really unfortunate is we saw Luis Caicedo and not the same formation in the 4-4-2 diamond the Revolution played against the Red Bulls, and I thought that was one of the best performances we've seen from a Revolution player all season long, maybe second only to some of Carles Gil's performances, and he hasn't gotten to play that role since. So that it's tough on Luis Caicedo that he's a really good player, and we saw him have an absolute dominant performance against the New York Red Bulls as that kind of lone central defensive midfielder in a 4-4-2 diamond shape. And he, since then they've been forced to play him at right back or all sorts of other positions where it hasn't worked as well. So I feel a little bit bad for Luis Caicedo that he hasn't had the opportunity to shine in some of his best positions after being so dominant there in that one game he got to do it.
Yep. No, absolutely. One more note on Carles Gil. I don't think we've talked about him for a few weeks because there are concerns elsewhere on the field, and he kind of turns in performances week after week that we don't really need to talk about. Yesterday, 89% pass accuracy, 9 for 9 on take-ons, 12 ball recoveries. Overall, a really, really solid two-way game. He also suffered 6 fouls. So between this game and the Kansas City game where Kellen Rowe was pulling him down at every chance he got, Carles Gil has been taking a beating lately. But I did want to point out that it's been 6 games since Carles Gil had an assist. It's been 8 games since he scored a goal. So I think a lot of people kind of see him as the consistent player, but he really has not been having a whole lot of chances to make an impact on the offensive side of the ball. He did have that nice cross to Juan Agudelo on a free kick yesterday that almost went in, but I think that's another concern the Revolution have where, your best player overall is really not making an impact on the score sheet.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where if you're a team playing the Revolution, you look at the Revolution lineup and Carles Gil can beat you. So if you're a team, you look at Carles Gil and you say, let's make somebody else beat us. And who else on this team can beat you? And there's very few guys that have proven they can create other than Carles Gil. We talk about Dwan Jones and Tejan Buchanan. I think they're good players. They're nice rookies. They were good draft picks for the Revolution. And they're very dangerous on the counterattack. But when the Revolution are in possession, are those guys going to create something out of nothing? I don't think so. Not yet. They're still young players that could develop, but right now, even with Tejan Buchanan having some dribbling skills, I don't really see it. When Pinilla was at his best, which he hasn't been this season, minus maybe one game off the bench, really. He was a guy that could do that. Diego Fagundes, when he's at his best, he's a guy that could do that. Fagundes didn't see any time in this game. Pinilla came on in the 64th minute. So I don't think it's a shock that other team focus in on Carles Gil and kind of limit his opportunity to get space and for him to pick out key passes. He still had 2 key passes in this game, but if I'm a coach of another team, I look at this Revolution lineup and that's what I do. I focus on Carles Gil. If I need to have 2 guys tracking him all game, I do that because who else is going to beat you? You take your chances with Dwan Jones and Tejan Buchanan being the guys that beat you down the wings and set up a goal that way, but. It's not surprising to me that Carles Gil has been slightly less effective as far as getting goals and creating assists.
No, absolutely. And I guess we have one other position to talk about. It is the goalkeeper, Cody Cropper. The Cody Cropper redemption tour has gone completely sideways in the last 2 1/3 games. 13 goals conceded in the last, as I say, 2 1/3 games since his fatal mistake against Montreal a week and a half ago. 6 goals conceded in this one. Certainly not all of it is on Cody Cropper. But, I think anytime a keeper concedes 6 times, I think you're going to have questions about whether or not he's the guy going forward. And especially when the game before the keeper conceded 4 times and 3 times in the game before that. I did ask a poll question during the game yesterday, kind of near the end of full time, because there were some mixed reactions when I asked if it was Turner time. But I put out to a little poll. 73% of people responding, that's out of 66 votes, had Matt Turner being their choice to start next game. Cody Cropper 14%, Brad Knighton 13%. Obviously not a super scientific poll. I would imagine that if you were to poll all Revolution fans, it might be, I don't know, maybe 50% Turner, 30% Cropper, something like that. That's kind of where I was expecting it. But Sean, what are your thoughts on Cody Cropper, his performance yesterday, and do we see him next week in goal?
Yeah, I think you pointed out, along with a lot of others on Twitter, is the rebounds he were giving up were consistently in very dangerous places. And yes, some of that's on defenders for not reacting, but there were some shots, he made some good saves in this game. I'll give him credit. But there were other shots that weren't that difficult to save, and he saved it and then coughed up bad rebounds, and the Revolution have paid for that. And I think the third goal in this game, too, was kind of a slow dribbler that he got a hand to and couldn't keep out of the net. I've got a lot of patience for Cropper this season because I think most of the goals that if he's conceded, you really couldn't put blame on him. There were a lot of goals in this one where I think you could put blame on him either for A, not saving like that third goal, or B, for giving up a very tasty rebound on a chance where maybe he could have pushed that ball out of bounds, or he could have pushed that ball away from the center of the box. So yeah, it wasn't a good game from him. We talked about that error that kind of led to the loss against Montreal a few weeks ago. His performance last week, I don't think it was too much you could put blame on him for in Kansas City. But I think again, Brad Friel kind of has a 50-50 decision here. You could go with Cropper, give him one more game, give him a chance to redeem himself, or you could switch to Turner. I've said it all season long. I think Turner is the goalkeeper the Revolution have with the highest ceiling. At this point of the season, with how poorly the Revolution have done, they're still not that far behind in the standings because way too many teams in MLS make the playoffs. But at this point, given how things are going, I think it would make sense to turn to Turner and kind of ride him for the rest of the season, unless he really, proves that he shouldn't be starting. Because I do think long term that he's the goalkeeper that has the potential to actually be, an all-star keeper if you can find consistency. I don't think Cropper's ceiling from what we've seen over the past few years is as high as Turner's. I don't think Brad Knighton certainly is as high as Turner's. He's maybe more consistent. But we've seen enough of all three of these guys now to kind of know what they're capable of, and Matt Turner at his best has been far better than what we've seen out of Cody Cropper at his best or Brad Knighton at his best, in my opinion. So at this point, if I was making the decision, I'd probably switch to Turner. But I do think it's kind of a 50-50 call at this point, because I think it's really terrible to constantly keep switching goalkeepers. Goalkeeper, like striker, is a position where confidence matters a lot. So if you have a manager that keeps showing no confidence anytime there's one little error here or there, it's not a great look.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. And we are a pro Matt Turner podcast, so I think I'll have to give the tip to Matt Turner as well next week. I think I feel like it's a little unresolved whether or not Matt Turner is going to be anything in MLS, because he did have that hot start last year. He kind of faded, and then he lost his starting role to Brad Knighton. But overall, I thought what we saw from Matt Turner was an overall positive. And I think he proved that he could be a potential MLS starter long term. So yeah, I think at some point you have to turn it back over to Turner at some point, no pun intended. And I don't know, I just don't see him riding the bench out the rest of his career with the Revolution, because I think a lot of people will be a little confused to why he was left off without getting even really a full season under his belt. Cody Cropper we saw in 2017, and we've talked about this before, but his expected goals to actual goals differential was one of the worst in the league in 2017 when he was given a full season. And I'd imagine that, not a lot of these goals are his fault, but I'm sure that the expected goals to actual goals differential does not speak well to him, this season after conceding as many goals that have gone in. If you look at the goals yesterday, the second and third ones I'd say are probably the two where you can really put more blame on Cropper. The second one too, Edgar Castillo, guy gets in between Edgar Castillo. He's at a wide angle. Cody Cropper has that angle sealed off. I mean, it was a chip. Obviously wasn't expecting it very much, but that was probably a play that he should have had. And then that third one, he got a bit of a palm on it, but it rolled into the net. Not a whole lot the defenders can do about that one. So I think if there's blame to be placed, it's on those two. And then I think the fourth and the sixth goals, both of them were on juicy rebounds that were just tapped in. Some of that's tough luck, but again, I think there are some goalkeepers that don't give up those rebounds or push them not towards the center of goal where there's someone, in the box ready to tap it home. So yeah, overall, not all of that can be on Cropper. I certainly think the defense had a worse game than Cody Cropper, but I do think there is some blame to place on Cody Cropper. And I think it's legitimate to wonder if Matt Turner should be starting next week, because as I say, if Matt Turner wasn't on this team and it was Brad Knighton, I think a lot of people would say, nah, just ride out with Cody Cropper. But I think you're going to have to go back to Matt Turner at one point, because he was a fan favorite when he came out, and I don't know. It's got to be turned over to Matt Turner at some point. And I feel like if you're not going to give Turner that chance and you're going to ride with Cody Cropper, it's a bit of a head scratching decision.
Yeah, and look, he made 9 saves in this game, so you got to give him some credit for there were a few shots that were difficult that he saved.
It was not a disastrous performance by Cropper by any means. I do not mean it is very legitimate to say that the 6 goals are more on the defense than on Cody Cropper. Yes. I certainly agree with that. But there were 2 goals that Cody Cropper could have saved and he didn't. I mean, you look at the 6 goals, and all of that is not on Cody Cropper, but there are still 2 that I attribute directly to Cropper. So, it's a bit of a tough one, but I think you do have another young goalkeeper in Matt Turner, and I think you got to give him the reins eventually. And it might not be this game, but we had this question after Montreal, we had this question after Kansas City. I wonder if Cropper, even if he does start next week, if this is it for him. If he has another bad performance against Chicago, I don't know how many bad performances you have to have until you switch up the goalkeeper.
I just wanted to bring one other point up that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. Because as we were doing this, I took a look over to the Audi index for this game that we've sometimes talked about, but haven't talked about too much lately. And for this game, since we were talking about Edgar Castillo earlier, we mentioned that he had that great assist. So he got a lot of points for that great assist, but he still finished this game with a negative 26 on the Audi index. So, my judgment of his defensive performance is based more on the eyeball test than on stats for this one. But clearly the stats show that he had a terrible game too. So that's, worrying for the Revolution that their veteran left back that they traded for played so poorly in this one. But just wanted to point out that the stats support our conclusion that he had a horrible game.
Sean, that kind of wraps up our discussion about the Revolution players and us kind of ripping into them. But we don't have a lineup discussion this week because it was mostly the same lineup minus Michael Mancienne coming back in. But you wanted to talk briefly about the injury report. I had a tweet yesterday that I think it should have been gotten more likes. I was a little offended, but I said something along the lines of the MLS where the salary cap rules are made up and the injury reports don't matter. So I want your thoughts on the injury report because we both were kind of misled when we saw Antonio De La Mea not on it this week.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of scratching our heads last weekend when Mancienne and De La Mea weren't on it, and both of them were out injured. And so we assumed, maybe those injuries really were last minute and didn't get on the injury report. Fine. So this week, neither of them were on the injury report again. Okay. It turns out that Mancienne was fairly hobbled and was taking painkillers. You would have kind of thought he would have been questionable. That's fine that he wasn't. He played, so big deal. But De La Mea, we heard last week he was had concussion-like symptoms, and then we heard on this broadcast that he was going through concussion protocol. It sounded like he had a impact test and didn't pass it. Why is he not on the injury report when he hasn't passed the concussion protocol yet? It seems kind of bizarre that you're going through the concussion test and you're going to give him the impact test and whatever other tests there are, and he hasn't passed them, and he's not at least questionable on the injury report. Because you and I saw that injury report, and like, oh, good for the Revolution. They're going to have Mancienne and De La Mea back. They can go back to 2 actual center backs playing center back, put Andrew Farrell at right back. It's not a big deal that Annie Baba and Brandon Beyer are out. I think we can talk about who's better between Annie Baba, De La Mea, and Mancienne, but to me there's not that much difference, and they're relatively interchangeable. That says a lot given the salaries difference between those guys. But looking at that, I think it would have the Revolution would have been a lot better off if they had 2 center backs and a right back. And based on the injury report, we kind of thought they would. So what's the point of the injury report if a guy that hasn't cleared concussion protocol doesn't even get listed on it? I don't really get how that works. But it's pretty clear that the Revolution he didn't know whether or not he was going to be able to play up until shortly before the game. So doesn't that mean he's at least questionable? Right?
Yeah, no, and I agree. I'm not totally sure the reasoning to why he wasn't even at least listed as questionable. I'd imagine that a lot of teams know that Mancienne, if you're Jim Curtin and the Philadelphia Union, you know that Mancienne and Mancienne and De La Mea were out last game. You know that there are injury problems along the back line. So I don't know if it's really secretive to not include him. I mean, I think that's kind of what they're going for, that they want to keep the Union guessing and not know what to prepare for. But I don't even understand why you can't just list De La Mea as questionable, because obviously he's coming off of a concussion. I think a lot of people know that he's going to be, he has those issues and he's recovering. Same thing with Mancienne. I mean, his injury that he had last week, to my understanding, is not really a 1-week thing. So I was very confused to see him not listed, and then Brad Friel comes out this week and says, "Oh yeah, just to let you know, he's playing on painkillers." I mean, I'm not sure what the point of injury reports are if teams aren't going to give accurate information. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So yeah, no, I'm not a big fan of injury reports if it's just going to be, I don't want to say misleading, but and this isn't the first time too. I feel like there have been other times too where injuries have been, sprung up. They release the lineup, and then Jeff Lemieux will say, "Oh yeah, so by the way, so and so is hurt," and they'll say like, "Oh, he was hurt yesterday," so it's after the injury report. But I think with De La Mea staying out, I really question the validity of injury reports and if we even need them.
Is this like the reverse Patriots, where the Patriots would like list Tom Brady as injured every single week, even though you knew he was going to play, or the Revs are just like leaving guys off there to confuse their opponent?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what they're going for. I guess Brad Friel's trying to learn a little bit from Bill Belichick, but I don't know. It seems quite pointless to me. So,
I mean, I don't think it's any teams are shaking in their shoes to if De La Mea is playing instead of Farrell at center back. Given the way the Revolution
Jaleel Anibaba is starting over De La Mea, I don't think any teams are like, "Oh crap, we need to rewrite our entire game plan here." Whatever.
Yeah.
Sean, you want to get to some Twitter questions?
Yeah, actually, I just had one last thing I wanted to touch on before we do Twitter questions, sure. And that's the Athletic article that came out this week by Sam. I'm not going to pronounce his last name because I would butcher it. But the one part of that I wanted to point out, because we talked about how kind of dead the Revolution looked in the second half of this, was the quote from Andrew Farrell, in which Farrell said, "We burned ourselves out last season." And then added to that teams realized what we're doing. We didn't catch many off guard with the higher press towards the end of the year, and we struggled. Have they burned themselves out already this year, you think, based on what we saw in the second half of this last game where they looked kind of dead?
I don't necessarily think they've burned themselves out, but I think that they know that they're not a playoff team. They know they're not going anywhere. And most importantly, there's no promotion relegation, so obviously they're not motivated.
Yeah, no players outside their cars either.
Yeah, it's a road game, so they're not going to have any fans standing by their cars because they're taking the team bus. So there's really no motivation there. No, I mean, I think they know early on that this is a bit of a lost season. And I mean, it points to that players don't like playing under Brad Friedel. You can kind of tell that a lot of people have checked out and they're not buying into this team, and they're not buying in. And you can have as many players only meetings or closed door meetings or heart to hearts and sing Kumbaya as many times as you want. But, this is the second time in 3 games that this team has folded like a chair. The second that they've conceded a goal late in the game, and they really don't have a whole lot of fight back. So I think it's really more that this is just a team that's spiraling downhill, and the attitude in the locker room is negative, and it's a bit contagious, and it's kind of spreading throughout the team. That's my guess. I mean, you can kind of see that these players don't want to be there right now.
Well, and the only other thing I'll add is if they burn themselves out, halfway through last season or whatever it was last season, isn't that put more onus on them in the offseason to have gotten more depth? Right? Isn't that just another thing that adds to the fact, like, oh, we're playing in a system where we get burned out? Doesn't that make depth even more important?
I mean, they added depth up front, on one side.
They did on one side, and they completely ignored the other side. They, they got rid of Dielna, which made sense, and didn't replace him. And they, brought in Castillo, but then they got rid of Samoya. So, if anything, they have less defensive depth this year than they did last year, because at least last year, for part of the season, there was a hint that Gabriel Somi might play.
Let me ask you this too, Sean. We have the transfer deadline. The first transfer window is closing this week on May 7th. So I guess that's Tuesday. That's 2 days away. Are you expecting any moves for the Revolution to make, or do you think that, with the way this season is going, do you think that the Revolution might actually be active in this window and make a move or two?
I think we heard somewhere, and I'm blanking on where we heard it, that there was a 50-50 chance that DP could still come.
Yeah, so he's not coming.
So he's not coming. The
DP who is real, we totally believe is real.
Well, like I was saying earlier, I don't think it's that difficult to get a warm body that can play defense in. And at this point, that's better than nothing. So part of me thinks that the Revolution will go out and make the obvious move and, get an American defender. Maybe they pull one from a USL squad. Maybe they pull one off the street that, hasn't been playing, like an Otto Lowy like they did a few years ago or several years ago now. But maybe they go back and find a way to bring Josh Smith back or something. But part of me thinks that they have to do that and then the other part of me knows that they should have been doing that weeks ago, and they haven't done it yet. So I don't know what to make out of it. I still think that they're going to bring in some American player that's not a big name signing, that's a kind of a nobody, just to plug some gaps in defense and be a warm body back there. But other than that, do I expect them to make an impact signing before the window closes? No. I think they'll probably make an impact signing in July when it's too late.
I was actually thinking the other way because you mentioned earlier they have 2 open roster spots. I actually wouldn't be shocked to see them send someone out, maybe someone who's kind of fallen out of favor in this team. I wouldn't be shocked to see, let me pick a name here. I don't want to say Teal Bunbury, but let's say Teal Bunbury. I wouldn't be shocked to see Teal Bunbury traded for maybe a draft pick or something along those lines. I don't think Teal Bunbury would be traded. I think he's too respected in that locker room. But I'm sure there's some people that are on the outside of the 18 or frequently in the bench. Maybe Fagundes. I mean, the thing with Fagundes, though, is that he actually is an asset that I think a lot of teams would pay for. I know that a lot of our listeners are low on Diego Fagundes, and that's fine. But you have to understand he's on a team-friendly contract, and he's 24 years old. I mean, he's the fastest player in MLS history to score 50 goals. There are multiple articles last year that did MLS trade value, and Diego Fagundes is listed in, I think, the top 30. So you don't go from being a top 30 asset in MLS one year and then drop, be worth a first, a super draft pick the following year. I mean, they could actually get some allocation money for him. And I think the move I'm kind of thinking of is, they really just want to clear a roster spot. Gabriel Somi would be the obvious choice, but I don't think anyone is really buying Gabriel Somi. So maybe a Wilfred Zahibo. I mean, maybe someone takes a chance on Wilfred Zahibo, similar to how Portland took a chance on Claude Dielma to see if he is worth anything. Maybe something along those lines. Maybe Ryan Wright impressed at USL that maybe there's a team that will, take him as a depth striker. I'm not so sure, but if you have 2 open roster spots, I think that the Revolution are hesitant to do anything because you only have 2 more signings until you have a completely full roster. And I don't know, I could see them sending a message to someone that, maybe they aren't very happy with the effort as of late. And, we see with NFL teams or MLB teams, I think last year, HaHa Clinton Dix was traded from the Packers after he screwed up something. The next week he was gone. He was traded for a 6th round draft pick. There are a couple instances
the Kai
like
Kamara
that.
situation where the Revs got him a few years ago.
That's a much better example actually of what I'm thinking of. I mean, this is such a disaster, and you have the trade deadline in 2 days from now. I mean, Juan Agudelo. I mean, MLS teams would take Juan Agudelo because they think the Revolution are misusing him. So maybe
maybe not at his salary. You'd probably have to send some allocation money with him.
Yeah, it would be, you would not be getting a whole lot back. But maybe you make an example and you say, you can be gone, next week if you're not putting in consistent performances. So I mean that's kind of speculation on my point, but this team has a lot wrong with it right now. And if I'm the Revolution, yeah, you're obviously looking into bringing in new players and bringing in some warm bodies, but I also think that there's a lot of players here that just aren't producing, and maybe you make an example, and just knowing that's in the Brad Friedel playbook of motivation of, if you're in this lineup this week, you earned it in training and it's all about effort and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think that, sending out someone for peanuts if they're not producing, or sending someone at a discount if they're not producing in the lineup might send that message to the team.
No, it's a good thought. No, it wouldn't shock me. There are some, there's a lot of redundant pieces on this roster. Guys that, like you talked about, because of those draft picks, the Revolution have a lot of guys that can play the wings. And right now Friedel seems down on Diego Fagundes, Christian Pania, both guys that have proven they can be very talented and good players in MLS. My only question there is, if the Revolution are starting to think about bringing in a new coach, and we talked about it a few weeks ago, or maybe it was last episode, I don't care. I've lost track at this point because they're all blending together, about how the Revolution have that big gap in June, and that seems like a time where you could make a coaching switch and give a guy a chance to kind of mold this team, and at least stylistically, over those 3 weeks, and set him up to have a better 2020 at that point. And maybe another coach finds a way to use Diego Fagundes, or finds a way to use Christian Pania, like they've been used in the past, and like they've been effective in the past. So that's my only hesitation there. But I do think it's a good point that if he wants to prove a point, there are some guys out there that you could trade, and maybe you trade one of them in MLS for a center back that's fourth string on some roster or something along those lines.
Yeah, and it's also another thing too to point out is that there's so much youth on this team. It's getting close to play the kids time. I mean, it's getting close to developing players as opposed to Tyon Buchanan and DeJuan Jones and Justin Rennicks for that matter should be playing more than Teal Bunbury if you're buried in last place. Because as great of a guy as Teal Bunbury is, he's not going to be here in 5 years, whereas Justin Rennicks or Tyon Buchanan might be. So there's that too.
Yeah, and Justin Rennicks has gotten pretty far down the depth chart at this point. It seems like with Pinilla and Fagundes moving to the bench, he seems to be behind them for kind of the same positions. So yeah, I mean that's your future right there. If this season is lost at some point, yeah, it does make sense to maybe offload some of the veterans that are underperforming and give a chance to the younger guys to play more.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. All right, so ready for Twitter questions, John?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we're actually going to go with a Facebook question. We got one question on Facebook. Oscar Liberos asks us, honestly, I just want to know what happened after the first half. Is it bad coaching or bad players?
A little of both. I think Philadelphia was good coaching from Philadelphia. They clearly adjusted at halftime. They kept their fullbacks back a little bit more, knowing that their wingers could still have a lot of joy against guys like Castillo. I think like we mentioned, Ilesino coming off the bench and really had a good time against Castillo. So I think Philadelphia kind of stopped Buchanan and Jones from being effective by making sure they closed those gaps and kept their fullbacks at home. And then knew they had enough offensively to still create chances, and that worked out really well in their favor. And the Revolution really didn't do anything to adjust. So it was a good adjustment by Philadelphia. They saw what the Revolution were doing. They found a way to counter it. And then, on the Revolution side, they didn't do anything to adjust. And then on the Revolution side, we talked about Mancienne looking even more dead in the second half. Castillo, wasn't good enough. So, both. Friedel didn't adjust, and the Revolution players weren't good enough to handle the adjustment that Philadelphia made.
Yeah. Mike Kennedy asks us, it seems like the central pair got murdered in the second half. Was it mainly Farrell and Mancienne or a lack of familiarity?
I do want to give Mancienne a bit of a break because of what Friedel said, and I think his play kind of reflected that he wasn't 100%. I don't think Farrell and Mancienne are a particularly good pair. I don't think Farrell should be playing center back as much as he does. He's again a guy that's good at doing a lot of emergency defending. But he has those big plays because the team gets stuck in situations where they have to emergency defend, and if the positioning and the communication was better between those two, that might happen less. But with that said, I think Castillo was a bigger problem than both of them in this game.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too, and I think we're giving Mancienne a bit of a hall pass too, because he's on painkillers and because he's not 100%. We did have another question from Barbara S. What do you think about Mancienne? Is he a main part of the problem? I think overall, in general, we've kind of been critical of Mancienne's performance this year, and the fact that he's still maintained the captain's armband. But I don't think you can really criticize too much because he clearly was not 100% at all yesterday. So
yeah, well, when you say is he part of the problem, but then is De La Mea a better option? And I'm not sure we've seen performances this year to say definitively that De La Mea is a better option, or that Andy Baba and De La Mea are a better pairing than Mancienne and one of the two of them. So given his big salary and given the fact that he's captain, he's an easy target and he should be a target. But when you say is he part of the problem, do they have someone they can switch to that's better? I don't know that the answer is yes.
Yep. John Trainer says, someone please give Andrew Farrell a hug. Played out of position again, hung out to dry tactically, and then has to go in front of a camera and explain this fiasco post-game. Man deserves better than this. And I got to say, too, I mean, we aren't giving a whole lot of credit to the back line, rightfully, after yesterday, but Andrew Farrell does seem to take accountability after the game. I think when we talk about people who might have the captain's armband, I think Andrew Farrell had it at one point last year, too. He certainly does take responsibility, and I don't want to say that he didn't put much of an effort forward, but I think that Andrew Farrell is giving 100% at all times. And but as I say, out of position, doesn't look 100% comfortable. Agree with all that.
The only thing I'll say on that note is that the last game Andrew Farrell played right back in, I thought he was one of the weakest players on the pitch for the Revolution. So I feel bad for him that he gets stuck playing out of position. And he's, had some big moments this season, but I think I want to say it was the Montreal game where he last played right back and was really poor. So, and I think he made some mistakes in this game as well. So, yes, he takes responsibility, and yes, he works really hard, and yes, he's had some big moments this season. But he's not without fault either.
Marcos Aguilar asks, what does Friedel tell his players after a game like that? What does he tell them moving forward? With such poor results, players may, if not already, start to lose faith in the manager. And actually, Friedel had some interesting comments about what he said post-game. He said something to the effect of, I talked to them after the game. I normally don't do that because emotions are highest, or something along those lines, which is a bit of an interesting thing to say, because I think a lot of people expect you to talk to your team after a game. So we actually do know what he said. But Sean, what are your what do you think Friedel can do, and what do you think Friedel can say to his team to turn the ship around?
I don't know what you say to your team at this point. The tactics you're giving them aren't working. They're not performing up to the level that, in some cases, you've seen them perform at higher levels in past seasons. At this point, I'm not sure what Friedel can do to turn things around, because I feel like, he's probably tried everything that he thinks he can try. I don't know what the options are at this point, to be honest. He's in a tough position. He's put himself into that tough position, but he's in a really tough position now, where, after a team is defeated in that fashion, especially after the way they played in the first half and played well, I don't know what you tell a team. There's only so many games in which you can say, hey, this is kind of a moral victory. We did something well in the first half and we can build on that. But you're 11 games into your second season now. I'm not really sure that that's going to hit home with your players at this point. So I'm, if I knew what to say in that situation, maybe I should be coaching.
Well, not just that too, but this is mostly the same roster as last year, where he kind of, criticized them for not putting full effort, towards the end of the season. And I think a lot of players were tuning out to that message already, and it's kind of rolled into this season. This isn't like he has new players too. I mean, whatever he is trying to tell them, he's been trying to tell them for 9 months. So, boy, it's really rough. I'm not sure how they're going to dig their way out of this hole. Brad Friedel really is. I mean, his hot seat is getting warmer and warmer, it seems like, by the week. And I don't know what he can do to turn around. But anyway, we actually have kind of the standard questions after a loss, questioning when we'll see a change there. Mohammed Hussein says, how much longer until we see a change in the front office and in the coach? Adam McLean asks us, will Burns finally be fired? And then I'll just say he's at hashtag Friedel out. How long will it be until management starts to notice / change things? So, we get a lot of these questions after every game, after every loss. I think the last point we talked about this, we were looking at the international break in June, where the Revs have about 20 days off. And we said that might be the earliest we see a change in coach. Sean, any change in your opinion after last night?
Look, and that's also the time when, a lot of coaches become available too, is around then, when other teams are making moves, or if the guy's coaching in Europe, when their season's over and they might be making a move. So if I'm the Revolution front office, I'm maybe not making the move yet, but I'm actively looking to see who might be available in June, because I don't think there's, too much gained by, letting Friedel go and bringing up one of his assistants as an interim coach for a couple of weeks until you can find somebody better. I think if you're the Revolution, you're in a position now where you take some time to find who that next coach could be, and you work on that. And if you can get somebody that's available, you bring them in June and you let Friedel go then. Assuming he doesn't have a miraculous turnaround before then. But I still couldn't really see the Revolution making a move right now. Even if they did, I'm not sure that it would benefit them too much, because I doubt the right coach is available right now, or it wouldn't be just panic signing to replace him. You'd go to some interim coach that's on Friedel's staff, and I think they kind of need a clean break when they do make that break.
What about Mike Burns? I mean, obviously, I think, replacing the coach, there's going to be a lot of tactic changes, and, it'd be very messy to do it mid-season, especially with that DP coming in. Do you think Mike Burns isn't on solid ground? Do you think that we might be seeing a change at the GM position anytime soon?
I think it's kind of the same boat as when they make that change of coaching. They also should be making the change at GM. We saw what happened in Colorado, where they pulled the plug really quickly. Their GM's been doing a poor job. They haven't got rid of him yet, but he's only been there 4 years. Burns has been here 15, and has done a pretty poor job, I would argue. And coaching staff, they made a quick coaching staff there too. But I think the Revolution are at a point where Burns has been here so long. He hired Friedel, he hired Heaps. I don't think Heaps was a complete disaster. Friedel has been so far. To me, that those both happen at the same time. At the same time, if you can find somebody that's experienced and that's available now at that position, maybe you do that so you don't lose another transfer window. With a GM that maybe you're thinking about replacing.
Should be noted too that, as you mentioned, Colorado fired their coach Anthony Hudson. He was in his third season. Brad Friedel is only in his second. And yeah, you're right that the GM, everyone's looking at the GM because obviously that was one of his hires. He's on the hot seat as well. I would say that, and I think I've said this a number of times, but I think that if Brad Friedel goes, you have to fire Mike Burns. And I think they're giving him another full season. I think that they want to see where the Revolution end up after a full second season. And I think too, there are a number of players that Brad Friedel, you can tell, has had a hand in bringing in. Michael Mancienne being one of those. His contract expires at the end of the season, so that might be a little bit of a easier breakup to let him go along with Brad Friedel and Mike Burns. I don't think anyone is going to come in and fix this short term anyway, so I think there's no real hesitation from the Revolution ownership to let this second season play out under the Brad Friedel tenure, and then make a decision at the end of the year. I still think he gets the full year, but who knows if we have 2 or 3 more of these games where the Revolution are giving up 6 goals. I think you're going to see, and I do think that sped up the Jay Heaps firing, that 7-0 loss in Atlanta. I was pretty convinced that they were going to let Jay Heaps finish out the season, let him go at the end of the year. I think his contract expired at the end of the year regardless. It seemed like they were just doing him a favor of letting him, mutually part ways, and that 7-0 loss happened, and it seemed like I think he was fired a week or 2 later. Sean, I don't know if you remember. You have a better memory than me of those things. But it seemed like that 7-0 was the the nail in the coffin for Jay Heaps. So, if there's another game like this where it's 5-6, 6-0 or something along those lines, I think that certainly speeds up the process in replacing Brad Friedel.
Just to clarify on Hudson, he was actually brought in at the end of 2017, so I think you might have saw 2017 on his resume, but he's been here just the same length as Friedel. The only credit I'll give to Friedel, though, is Hudson finishes his tenure as head coach with only 8 wins. Friedel's got 12, so that's 50% better.
Yeah, and Brad Friedel also hasn't completely trashed his players publicly.
No,
Anthony Hudson more or less resigned when he said that he had the worst roster in MLS, or he said that they're in the
bottom group of players is what he called them.
Which isn't even true. I mean, they have Phil Haber and they have Kai Kamara. Like, there are some good pieces and Tim Howard. They have some good pieces in Colorado. I know they're aging and they're veterans, but to call them bottom class players is ridiculous.
Well, and when you're responsible for bringing in a good chunk of them too,
right.
But how do you we talked about Friedel. He questioned this player's efforts publicly, which I don't think is the greatest. But this is a whole nother level. What Hudson did. How do you show your face at practice the next day after calling your players a bottom group of players?
That's what I mean. I can't believe it took him. I think they fired him on a Wednesday, and he made the comment Sunday. I was surprised it took that long. I was truly surprised it took until Wednesday to let go of him. I really kind of figured that they'd have a meeting later that night and say, yeah, you can't coach this team anymore. So.
And the one thing I will say about Friedel is his comments have kind of been trending in the opposite direction, where I think we rightfully called him out for not really putting any blame on himself. But as the season's gone along, and I don't know if somebody's talked to him, I kind of get the impression based on the 180 he's done that maybe somebody did, that he's taken a lot more blame on himself than put it on the players. So I think that he's trended away from what it was that Anthony Hudson did.
No, I agree. I think there's some slight differences too. So you're absolutely right in the call out. That's what I saw. I saw 2017, and I was under the impression he had more time than he did. It really is about a comparable amount of time to Brad Friedel. But yeah, overall, I think Brad Friedel is not at that point where Anthony Hudson is at just yet. As I say, I still think Brad Friedel's getting the rest of the season. So we'll be answering those questions all season long, I think, Sean. Phil Fleischer asks us, the Revs have 4 games in 2 weeks, including that friendly against Chelsea. The MLS opponents are pretty mediocre, but it's pretty unlikely that the Revolution will get more than 3 points. If this season is a complete loss, what roster moves can be made to save next season?
Yeah, I think if this season is a complete loss, your best bet at this point is to try to avoid tying the hands of the next coach by bringing in big guaranteed contracts. Avoid bringing in the next Gabriel Somi that's going to be stuck on your roster for a couple of years. Avoid maybe even signing this next designated player unless they're a surefire home run that the next coach might not want. Avoid doing what you did with Jay Heaps, where you spent a lot of money on Christian Namath, who clearly didn't fit Brad Friedel's plans when Brad Friedel took over shortly thereafter. If this season ends up being a complete loss, I think that's what you do. Again, unless you can go out in June, I think the best move you could make is to go out in June, find your next coach, give him the summer window to make a couple moves, and then position him in a lot better of a place to start next season and kind of realize that this season, isn't going to be the one that gets you over the hump. Although in saying that, we have seen some teams go out there and change coaches in June and completely turn things around. It's not unheard of. The Revolution did it actually in 2002 when they changed coaches after the first few months and went on a run. They had that fantastic roster that year that was largely disappointing at the beginning of the season. I think it's a different situation because the roster was much better back then. But it's really not unheard of for teams to do that, change coaches midseason and go on a run. But I'm rambling a bit here, but my thought process would be that you bring in that coach in June and give him the opportunity to make decisions in the midsummer transfer window, if that is your thought process, that this season's over after this next stretch of games if the Revolution don't pull off a couple wins.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're looking at midseason, I kind of talked about this earlier, you need to get rid of your big salary players that are kind of blocking your younger players from playing. I think guys like Juan Agudelo, you're trying to get rid of him, even if it's for a measly return, so you can get Brian Wright some reps. Teal Bunbury, you want to move him elsewhere and get what you can for him. And that's for two respects. You want to get your young players some playing time, and you want to build some assets. So when you are ready to get in a position where you are looking at the playoffs, you have allocation money or draft picks or whatever to make a move. So yeah, there's a lot of things they can do if they are looking forward to next season, because there's a lot of players that are making a decent amount of money and aren't exactly producing. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It'll also be interesting to see how many, if Mancienne is playing as much as he is down the stretch, because I imagine he's not coming back with the Revolution next year, especially if Brad Friedel is fired. At least based on that salary cap, I can't imagine he resigns with the Revolution.
The only other thing I want to say too is, we talk about the mediocre schedule the Revolution have coming up against, not great teams. They're playing the Chicago Fire, who have been underperforming this season. Chicago, and there's a lot of reasons to, talk about Chicago Fire and the tough situation they're in. But they went out and made a trade for Francisco Calvo, the captain of Minnesota United, to come in and fix their defense. You can make trades at this point of the season to make huge improvements. I think Calvo could have a huge impact on Chicago Fire. And maybe he'll do that on Wednesday when they face the Revolution. But that's an example of something the Revolution could do. And maybe they overpaid for him, and maybe you need to overpay for him. But, the Revolution should have plenty of TAM and GAM at this point to go out and make a move like that. And we see other teams doing it. So it's just something to think about when you look at the Revolution's upcoming schedule. With that said, San Jose is the next home game for the Revolution. And if the Revolution cannot get points against the San Jose side that's been, really poor this season, and if they go into Chicago and they get nothing, and then they go into San Jose and get nothing, maybe you don't fire Brad Friedel right before the Chelsea game, but if he's not on the hot seat at this point, at that point, you're in serious trouble.
The Offside Trap has some comments too about Brad Friedel. He says Friedel's tactics seem to be 100% based on pressing up as high as possible. It makes for entertaining games, but will usually lead to a loss, especially with this roster. It seems painfully obvious to me that Brad Friedel is a terrible manager. We have enough talent to be mid-table, but our team is too predictable. We press high and have a weak back line. We can never sustain an effective high press for 90-plus minutes. This DP better be a game changer, or we are absolutely screwed. Don't get your hopes up, I would say. And even a new DP, I don't think that changes a lot of the tactics in the back line. As we've said, I mean, it's tinted that this player coming in as a midfielder, so I still think those problems will exist. Sean, I don't know if you have anything to add on that. I think that's kind of what we've been talking about already.
The only thing I'll disagree with on there is I don't think the high press leads to entertaining games, with the exception of that Sporting KC game. I think if you have a good high press, maybe it can, but the Revolution's high press has more often than not led to pretty boring games or blowout losses. So I agree with everything that was said except for the entertaining games part.
The Offside Trap also says, how weird is it that it feels like the first half was the best half of soccer the refs have played all season? And he also says, how good is Carlos Gil? He had some insane runs this game despite the awful scoreline, both of which we already have touched upon. So I don't feel the need to dig too heavily into that. But it really is kind of crazy to wrap your head around the fact that the Revolution, played extremely well in Kansas City, couldn't close out the job, and then had an incredibly good first half in Philadelphia, and once again ends the game in a completely miserable spot. Really just a total letdown 2 weeks in a row.
No red cards, though. That's a positive.
No red cards. Got to look at the positives. Zachary Grimes asks us, is this the most embarrassing loss in the Brad Friedel era?
There's some competition for that. I would argue that the 3-0 home loss to a Montreal side that was missing their two best players and arrived a couple hours before the game on their plane and was stuck at the tarmac for hours and was stuck at the airport hours the day before, 5+ hours, might be more embarrassing just given that game's at home and given the scenarios. But this is certainly up there and is in the conversation with a few other losses. But if I had to pick, I might still go with that Montreal game, just given the circumstances were completely aligned for the Revolution to come out of that game with a win.
I actually would go with the LA Galaxy game, because that was 3 points secured. You had a massive crowd on hand, and that game was the turning point of that 2018 season. You could kind of tell the team, and they've admitted that too, that after that loss, everything kind of turned and spiraled downhill for them. So it doesn't look as bad on paper, but I think that 3-2 Galaxy loss, a Galaxy team that didn't even make the playoffs, and Zlatan wasn't playing. I think that one takes the cake for me in terms of the most embarrassing loss, just because it was so sudden and it was so impactful. The Montreal game, as you say, is also up there. I think, too, that even though it was a 2-0 game, I think the Atlanta game from a few weeks ago you can add in there just because it was so one-sided. And Atlanta had so many struggles coming in that you expected the Revolution to put up a bit of a fight. I think losing to the FC Cincinnati, the expansion side at home, was ridiculously embarrassing as well. I think that just and FC Cincinnati's form in the past month or so has been pretty dreadful. So they're acting more like an expansion team. I think at the time you could at least take, as a bit of a consolation that FC Cincinnati was, I think they went in and tied Atlanta. They seem to be battling for a playoff spot. They've kind of been moved back down into the bottom of the table. So there is some competition there. I think the Galaxy is number one overall for me. I'll take Montreal over this game too, but this one's probably a solid number 3 for me. Ultimately, the scoreline is what will stand out, but it was goal. The game was over after 3-1, so I think at the end of the day, it does not impact me personally that much. I think it's just losing to a similar market, a team with a similar budget, and a team that is just ran much more efficiently, and having that score line, which is so embarrassing.
Yeah, you mentioned Cincinnati, and they're another team that's coach has commented on his players not being good enough recently. So they've kind of hit a rough spot
because they've taken a lot of players from their USL team and moved them up. So you can kind of actually understand that comment.
It's accurate. It's absolutely accurate. And
there are actually people on Twitter, FC Cincinnati fans on Facebook and Twitter, that are complaining about missing that they were they wish they were back in the USL because their season has gone downhill so quickly. So it's kind of funny to see that.
It's also funny. There were a lot of FC Cincinnati fans that if you said anything negative about their roster before the season would freak out on you. But
yeah, well, you could say that about the Revolution too. I remember Matt Doyle saying that the Revolution it was Christian Penilla and 10 question marks. And a lot of people did not take that well, and I was one of them. I thought the Revolution were going to battle for the playoff team, and turned out to be 100% wrong on that one. So
it's Carles Heel and 10 question marks at this point.
That is true. That is true.
Yeah, that was wrong.
Carles Heel question mark. So wrapping it up here, Cameron Young, is it time to make is it time to make changes to the entire starting lineup apart from players like Gil, Buchanan, and Caicedo? Even defensively without depth needs to be changed. I don't know how you make changes along the back line because they don't have the personnel, as we said. But Sean, do you think it's time to change up the lineup?
I mean, I honestly don't know what you do at this point. I'm 100% with you. There's not changes you can make in the back line. Playing guys out of position on the defense helps absolutely nobody. But with the rest of the lineup, Heel, obviously done enough to keep starting. Juan Caicedo has obviously done enough to keep starting. I still keep going back to the fact that Diego Fagundes and Christian Pinilla are really the only other two guys in this roster that I would trust to create something in possession when another team's on the defensive. But we haven't seen it this year, and they've been benched because of it. Yes, as the season wears on, I agree with your point about playing the kids, but otherwise, I don't know what you do at this point. I kind of, I think Friedel's done a poor job, and I don't know that he's gonna, has an way to change the tactics and make this work. Maybe another coach can make it work, but I don't know that changing the players at this point really does anything to help Friedel, because he's done it a lot already.
Yeah, no, agree. And we've seen a different lineup seemingly every week, except after a win. So, Sean, no more news, I don't think, from this week. Did you have any final thoughts that you want to throw out there?
No, I just, if you haven't read the Athletic article on the Revs this week, it's a worthwhile read, because it kind of details what goes on with the Revolution throughout the week and preparing for that difficult game, and talks about another closed door meeting. So if you hadn't heard about the closed door meeting before the Kansas City game, there was one then too. And also some interesting quotes from Juan Agudelo about that meeting finally making him feel like they were a team, and how they didn't feel like a team before that, which is also a bit concerning that 9 games into the season they didn't feel like a team. But a worthwhile read if you haven't read it.
Yeah, it's a bit concerning too, because a lot of these players played last year, so you wonder how long these feelings of resentment have been carried over. And you also wonder too, I mean, that article came out after the Kansas City game. It did seem like there were some positives coming out of that Kansas City game. I wonder if a lot of that is already outdated following a 6-1 loss in Philadelphia. So, but it is a good article. Go check it out. Sean, I don't really have any final thoughts, I don't think. Boston City FC had their home opener. It did not go very well. Hartford City won, I think, 5-0. It was 5-0 at halftime. I think that was the full-time result. Not exactly going very well for the Lions, but I don't think there's anything else that I really want to get to. I just need to go back. I need to take a nap. I'm getting really tired here, so let's wrap it up. You can follow us on Twitter at Revolution Recap, and also like our Revolution Recap page on Facebook. Please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. Sean, where can people follow you on Twitter?
You can follow me at Sean L. Donahue.
And the Revs have another midweek matchup in Chicago on Wednesday. We're unsure if we're going to have a midweek podcast. We're unsure of our availability. I'd love to do the bribery game where we ask for X number of reviews, and if we get a certain amount, we'll come back and do a podcast. We can't promise anything, but we still want to get reviews. So please, as I say, go to iTunes. If we get the more reviews we'll get, the more obligated we will be to make it work. It might not be Wednesday, it might be Thursday night that we release a podcast, but we'll do our best as we can. So Chicago on Wednesday, and then the Revolution return home to face San Jose next Saturday. Winnable game, in my opinion, right, Sean?
One of the few games on the Revolution schedule that you look at and think might be winnable. But San Jose has actually been playing a bit better in the last couple of weeks after starting the season terribly. They're still winless on the road, though.
Yeah, beat Kansas City, if I remember correctly. Beat Kansas City in Kansas City. So they're in good form right now, but have to fly across the country to Fortress Foxborough. Seems like a really big game for the Revolution to get back on the right track.
The weird thing in that was there was a Globe article this week where I think Frank DeLappa said they were expecting something like 30,000 fans for that game, and I cannot for the life of me figure out why. But I mean, if the Revolution have struggled for motivation because the stadium has been pretty empty for the last few games, I guess that won't be the case for this one, because at least according to Frank DeLappa's Globe article, I think he said they were going to get like 30,000 fans for that game, and I have no idea why, but I mean that might make it more reason to watch that one.
A lot of United States men's national team fans that are still mad at Chris Wondolowski and are going to stand outside his rental car after the game. I think that's my guess. So we'll have a podcast next Sunday or on Wednesday or Thursday. But until then, thanks everyone for listening, and go Revs.